Sarah Matthews woke up earlier than usual that morning, carefully selecting her most professional outfit, a navy blue suit that she had worn countless times during her FBI days. She knew from experience that appearance mattered, especially in places of authority. The traffic ticket sitting on her dresser reminded her of why she had to visit the courthouse today. As she drove downtown, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. After 15 years of serving in the FBI and handling some of the nation's most sensitive cases, here she was, heading to traffic court over a faulty traffic light. The morning sun reflected off the courthouse's white marble steps as she walked up, her low heels clicking against the stone. The courthouse hallway was already packed with people by 8:30 a.m. Some looked nervous, others appeared bored, and a few were clearly frustrated. Sarah found a seat on one of the old wooden benches, taking in the scene around her. A young mother tried to quiet her crying baby, while two teenagers in hoodies slouched against the wall, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. All rise. The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom at exactly 9:00 a.m. Judge Richard Harrison entered, his black robe flowing behind him as he walked to his bench. Sarah had done her homework. Judge Harrison had been presiding over traffic court for the past 8 years, and his reputation for being strict was well known throughout the county. Sarah watched carefully as the judge handled the cases before hers. A white businessman in an expensive suit got off with a warning for running a red light. A college student received a reduced fine for speeding. The proceedings moved quickly, with Judge Harrison barely looking up from his papers as he handed down his decisions. Case number 47, Sarah Matthews, the clerk called out. Sarah stood up, smoothing her suit jacket as she walked to the podium. She could feel all eyes in the courtroom on her. As a black woman who had worked in law enforcement, she was used to being noticed, but this felt different. Judge Harrison finally looked up from his papers, and Sarah noticed the slight change in his expression. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and his mouth tightened at the corners. She had seen that look before. During her FBI days, she had learned to read people's micro-expressions, and what she saw now wasn't encouraging. Ms. Matthews, Judge Harrison's voice carried a tone that wasn't present in the previous cases. You are here for running a red light on Oak Street on the evening of March 15th. How do you plead? Sarah stood straight, her voice clear and professional. Your Honor, while I acknowledge that I went through the light, I would like to explain the circumstances. The traffic light at that intersection has been malfunctioning, showing conflicting signals. I have documentation from the city's traffic department confirming this issue. She reached into her briefcase to pull out the papers, but Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. The same hand that had been so willing to accept documentation from previous defendants now seemed uninterested in her evidence. Ms. Matthews, he interrupted, his voice carrying a condescending tone that echoed through the courtroom. A malfunctioning light is not an excuse for breaking the law. As a citizen, you have the responsibility to exercise extreme caution in such situations. The proper procedure would have been to treat it as a four-way stop. Sarah noticed how he emphasized citizen and responsibility, words he hadn't used with other defendants. She also noticed how he had cut her off before she could present her evidence, something he hadn't done with anyone else that morning. The air in the courtroom grew thicker with tension. Some observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, sensing that something was different about this case. The bailiff, who had been looking bored all morning, was now watching with increased interest. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, shuffling through papers he had barely glanced at. Your driving record shows another incident from 2 years ago, a parking violation. His tone suggested he had just uncovered evidence of serious criminal behavior rather than a simple parking ticket that had already been resolved. Sarah remained composed, drawing from years of training in high-pressure situations. She knew that her next words and actions would matter not just for her case, but potentially for others who would stand where she was standing. The morning sun streaming through the high courthouse windows cast harsh shadows across the judge's face, highlighting the lines of disapproval that seemed to deepen with each passing moment. Little did Judge Harrison know that the woman standing before him had spent years investigating cases just like this one. Cases where authority figures abused their power, where justice wasn't quite as blind as it should be. For now, though, Sarah simply stood there, her FBI training allowing her to maintain a perfect poker face while her mind recorded every detail of this increasingly troubling interaction. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose as he looked down at Sarah. The morning had been routine until now, but something about this case made him sit up straighter, grip his gavel a little tighter. "Ms. Matthews," he said, emphasizing each syllable of her name, "would you care to explain why you think you're special enough to ignore traffic signals that every other citizen manages to obey?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the previous exchanges with other defendants. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her professional composure. Her years of FBI training had taught her to handle hostile situations with grace. "Your Honor, as I attempted to explain, I have documentation from the city's traffic department showing that the light at that intersection was malfunctioning on the date in question." She tried again to present her evidence, but Judge Harrison's hand shot up, stopping her mid-motion. The same hand that had accepted papers from the businessman earlier now acted as a barrier to her defense. "What I'm hearing," Judge Harrison continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "are excuses. I've been presiding over this court for 8 years, Ms. Matthews, and I've heard every excuse imaginable." He shuffled through her papers without really looking at them, a gesture that wasn't lost on the observers in the courtroom. The young public defender sitting in the back row had stopped scrolling through his phone, his attention now fully captured by the scene unfolding before him. Even the court clerk, who had been mechanically typing all morning, slowed her fingers on the keyboard, her eyes darting between the judge and Sarah. "Your Honor." Sarah tried again, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I respect the court and its procedures. That's precisely why I've gathered proper documentation to support my case." The traffic department confirmed that several complaints were filed about that intersection during the same week. Judge Harrison's face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to defendants who spoke with such clarity and confidence. Most people who stood before him stumbled over their words, accepted his lectures with downcast eyes, and hurried to pay their fines. "Let me be clear, Ms. Matthews," he said, removing his glasses and placing them deliberately on his desk. "The fine for running a red light is typically $150. However, given your attitude and your previous parking violation, I'm setting the fine at $500. Perhaps this will help you better understand the importance of following traffic laws." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The fine was significantly higher than any he had issued that morning, including to a teenager who had been caught going 20 miles over the speed limit. Sarah noticed an elderly white woman in the gallery shake her head in disapproval, while a young black man in the back row scribbled something furiously in his notebook. Sarah stood perfectly still, her FBI training kicking in as she mentally documented every detail of this interaction. She noticed how Judge Harrison's right eye twitched slightly when she maintained eye contact, how his left hand clenched and unclenched beneath his desk, how he had spent exactly 2.5 minutes on her case compared to the average 7 minutes he had given others. Furthermore, Judge Harrison added, seeming irritated by her continued composed demeanor, "I'm requiring you to attend a traffic safety course. Clearly, you need a refresher on basic road rules and proper respect for authority." The irony of his words almost made Sarah smile. If he only knew how many hours she had spent in high-speed driving courses during her FBI training, or how many times she had pursued suspects through complex traffic situations. "You have 30 days to pay the fine and enroll in the course," Judge Harrison continued, already reaching for the next case file. "Failure to comply will result in additional penalties. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice clear and measured. As she turned to walk away, she could feel Judge Harrison's eyes following her, perhaps unsettled by her unwavering composure in the face of his obvious bias. Sarah walked to the court clerk's desk to receive her paperwork, moving with deliberate slowness. She opened her wallet to check the fine payment details, and that's when it happened. The moment that would change everything. Her old FBI badge, still kept in a hidden compartment of her wallet, slipped out and landed on the clerk's desk with a soft but distinct thud. The clerk's eyes widened as she saw the badge, her fingers freezing over her keyboard. In that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted imperceptibly, like the quiet before a storm. Judge Harrison, already calling the next case, remained unaware that his carefully constructed world of unchecked authority was about to face its greatest challenge. Time seemed to slow down as the FBI badge lay gleaming on the clerk's desk. Mary Johnson, the court clerk who had worked there for 23 years, felt her breath catch in her throat. She had processed thousands of cases, but never had she seen anything quite like this. "Miss Matthews," Mary whispered, her eyes fixed on the badge. "Your asterisk, that asterisk, Sarah Matthews?" Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the badge, memories flooding back of news headlines and major cases from the past decade. Sarah gave a small, knowing smile and quietly nodded. She hadn't planned for this revelation, but perhaps it was time. Before she could respond further, Mary's eyes grew even wider with recognition. "Oh my goodness," Mary continued, her voice still hushed but excited. "You're the agent who led the Birmingham Police Department investigation. The one that exposed racial profiling in traffic stops." She glanced nervously at Judge Harrison, who was still occupied with the next case, oblivious to the unfolding situation at the clerk's desk. The young public defender who had been watching earlier edged closer, pretending to sort through his files. His ears perked up at the mention of the Birmingham case, one that was now taught in law schools as a landmark example of systematic discrimination. Sarah carefully retrieved her badge, but the damage, or perhaps the miracle, was already done. Mary's hands flew across her keyboard, pulling up old news articles on her computer. There it was, a younger Sarah Matthews, standing on the courthouse steps in Birmingham, surrounded by reporters as she announced the findings of a 2-year investigation that had led to major reforms. Word spread through the courtroom like a quiet wildfire. The elderly white woman who had shaken her head at Sarah's treatment now leaned forward with interest. The young black man with the notebook had stopped writing and was frantically texting on his phone. Even the bailiff, a retired police officer, straightened up as he remembered the case that had changed department policies across 3 states. Judge Harrison remained unaware of the subtle shift happening in his courtroom, continuing to process cases with his usual stern demeanor. But the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Every person who recognized Sarah's name now watched him with new eyes, seeing his actions through a different lens. "You know," Mary whispered as she processed Sarah's paperwork, "I've worked here since Judge Harrison started. The way he handled your case today," she paused, looking around cautiously before continuing, "it wasn't right, and it wasn't the first time." Sarah listened carefully as Mary spoke in hushed tones about patterns she had observed over the years. The different tones used for different defendants, the varying fine amounts for similar violations, the evidence that was accepted or dismissed based on who presented it. The young public defender, now standing close enough to hear, pulled out his phone and quietly showed Sarah his notes. He had been documenting similar observations for months but hadn't known what to do with the information. "Agent Matthews," he said softly, making sure Judge Harrison couldn't hear, "I got a whole folder of cases like yours. Different treatment, higher fines, dismissed evidence. But nobody would listen to a rookie public defender." Sarah's FBI training kicked in automatically as she heard this information. Her mind started cataloging details, identifying patterns, forming connections. What had started as a simple traffic ticket was evolving into something much larger. Just then, Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom again. "Next case." His gavel struck the sound block with the same authority he had always wielded, unaware that his courtroom had become ground zero for what would soon become a major investigation. As Sarah gathered her paperwork to leave, she noticed several people in the gallery taking photos of her with their phones. By tomorrow, local news outlets would be running the story. Former FBI Civil Rights Division star agent Sarah Matthews, known for exposing institutional bias, had experienced that same bias firsthand in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Mary touched Sarah's arm gently as she turned to leave. "Will you do something about this?" she asked, her eyes pleading. 23 years of witnessing injustice had taken their toll, and now, finally, someone who could make a difference had seen it too. Sarah looked back at Judge Harrison, still presiding with the same arrogant authority that had dismissed her evidence earlier. Her response was quiet but firm. "Some habits are hard to break, but patterns." She paused, thinking of all the cases she had built over her FBI career. Patterns are meant to be exposed. As she walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, Sarah's phone was already buzzing with messages. The story was spreading, and Judge Harrison's carefully constructed world of unchecked bias was about to face its day of reckoning. By the next morning, Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news stations had already picked up the story, and social media was buzzing with accounts from others who had faced similar treatment in Judge Harrison's courtroom. She sat at her home office desk, surrounded by notes and printouts, just like in her FBI days. This is bigger than one traffic ticket, Sarah explained to Marcus Chen, a civil rights attorney who had reached out to her. They sat in his downtown office, walls lined with law books and framed newspaper articles about his previous victories in discrimination cases. We need to look at every case Judge Harrison has handled. Marcus nodded, pulling up files on his computer. I've had clients complain about him before, but proving judicial bias is like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. He paused, looking at Sarah with newfound hope. But you've done this kind of investigation before, haven't you? Sarah smiled, remembering her FBI techniques. The key is in the patterns. We need data, lots of it. Court records, fine amounts, demographic information, everything from the past 8 years. She pulled out her laptop, already creating a spreadsheet template similar to ones she had used in previous investigations. Mary Johnson, the court clerk who had recognized Sarah's FBI badge, had been busy too. That morning, she arrived at work early, carrying a small USB drive containing years of court records she had access to. As she copied more files, her hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the excitement of finally doing something about what she had witnessed for years. Looking for these? Mary smiled as she handed the drive to Sarah during their quiet meeting at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. 8 years of Judge Harrison's cases, all organized by date, type of violation, and defendant information. Sarah's eyes lit up as she reviewed the files. Mary, this is exactly what we need. But aren't you worried about your job? She asked, concerned for the clerk's safety. Mary straightened her shoulders, her voice firm. I'd stayed quiet for too long. Some things are more important than job security. Back at Marcus's office, they began analyzing the data. The young public defender who had witnessed Sarah's case, Tom Rivera, joined them, bringing his own collection of case notes and observations. They set up a makeshift command center, reminiscent of Sarah's FBI operation rooms. Look at this, Tom pointed to his screen, excitement in his voice. In speeding cases involving white defendants, the average fine is $120. For minorities, it's $275 for the exact same speed violation. He scrolled through more data, revealing pattern after pattern of disparate treatment. Sarah moved around the room with purpose, directing their investigation just as she had done during her federal cases. We need to focus on 3 things, she explained, writing on a whiteboard. First, statistical evidence showing patterns of bias. Second, testimonies from defendants who experienced discrimination. Third, documented instances where similar cases received different treatment. The team worked tirelessly through the day. Marcus used his legal expertise to identify clear violations of judicial conduct. Tom organized his cases by type and outcome, creating a timeline of Judge Harrison's biased decisions. Mary's court records provided the backbone of hard data they needed. Local community leaders began reaching out as word spread about the investigation. Reverend James Wallace, a respected civil rights activist, arrived at the office with a stack of written complaints from his congregation members. These people were too afraid to speak up before, he said, placing the papers on Sarah's desk, but now they know someone's finally listening. Sarah read through the complaints, her FBI training helping her spot important details others might miss. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that had gone unchecked for years. By evening, the office walls were covered with charts, graphs, and timelines. Sarah stood back, looking at their work with satisfaction. This is how we did it in Birmingham, she explained to the team. Every data point tells a story, and together, they tell the truth. As they prepared to leave for the day, Marcus looked at the evidence they had gathered. You know Judge Harrison won't go down without a fight, he warned. He has powerful friends in the legal community. Sarah packed up her laptop, a determined smile on her face. That's exactly what they said in Birmingham too. But numbers don't lie, and patterns don't hide forever. Tomorrow, we start interviewing witnesses. This is just the beginning. 1 week into the investigation, Sarah's makeshift office looked like a war room. Charts covered the walls, computer screens displayed endless rows of data, and a steady stream of people came to share their stories. The evidence against Judge Harrison was growing stronger by the day. We've interviewed over 50 people now, Tom said, pinning another set of testimonies to their evidence board. The young public defender had taken time off work to help full-time with the investigation. The stories are all similar: higher fines, harsher treatment, dismissed evidence. Sarah nodded, studying a new batch of statistics on her laptop. Her old FBI training was paying off as she spotted patterns that others might miss. "Look at this," she called the team over. In cases involving broken tail lights, white defendants got warnings 85% of the time. For Black and Hispanic defendants, that number drops to just 15%. Marcus whistled low as he looked at the numbers. "And the fines for minorities are almost triple," he added, pointing to another column. The civil rights attorney had seen discrimination cases before, but never with evidence this clear. Mary Johnson, still working as the court clerk, continued to be their secret weapon. She sent daily updates about Judge Harrison's current cases, showing that even under growing scrutiny, he hadn't changed his ways. Yesterday, he fined a Black college student $300 for rolling through a stop sign, Mary reported during their evening meeting. An hour later, he let a white businessman off with a warning for the exact same thing. "I have it all documented right here." She handed Sarah another carefully organized file. The investigation had grown beyond their small office. Local news stations were running daily updates. Social media was filled with people sharing their experiences in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Even other judges in the district started paying attention, though they kept their distance publicly. "We got something big," Sarah announced one afternoon, her voice tight with excitement. She pulled up a series of graphs on the main screen. "I ran the numbers through the same analysis program we used in FBI cases. Over 8 years, Judge Harrison's fines for minority defendants averaged 340% higher than those for white defendants in identical cases." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Tom broke the silence first. "That's not just bias," he said, shaking his head. "That's a systematic pattern of discrimination." Reverend Wallace arrived later that day with more community members wanting to testify. "These people have been scared to speak up," he explained, as an elderly woman shakily told her story of being humiliated in Harrison's courtroom, but now they see hope for change. Sarah recorded each testimony carefully, just as she had done during her FBI investigations. Every story added another piece to their growing mountain of evidence. But she knew from experience that they needed more than just stories. They needed undeniable proof. That proof came unexpectedly through an intern at the courthouse. The young woman, Jenny Kim, had been secretly recording the judge's comments during breaks between cases. She brought them a USB drive filled with audio files. "He doesn't know I can hear him from my desk," Jenny explained nervously. "The things he says when he thinks no one is listening." She played one of the recordings, where Judge Harrison could be heard making clearly biased remarks about minority defendants. Sarah's team worked late into the night, organizing the new evidence. Marcus prepared legal documents while Tom created timelines of the judge's patterns of behavior. Mary cross-referenced the audio dates with court records, building an airtight case. "We got him," Sarah said finally, looking at their completed evidence wall. 8 years of discrimination laid bare in charts, testimonies, audio recordings, and statistical analysis. It reminded her of the Birmingham case, where the truth had seemed obvious once all the pieces were put together. But Sarah knew from experience that having evidence wasn't enough. Presenting it effectively was just as important. As she packed up for the night, she thought about the Judicial Review Board hearing scheduled for next week. Judge Harrison would face the consequences of his actions, but only if they presented their case perfectly. "Tomorrow we start preparing for the hearing," she told her tired but determined team. "Judge Harrison has no idea what's coming, but he's about to learn that justice works both ways." The lights in their office stayed on late that night, as they organized their evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to ignore. Outside, the city slept, unaware that tomorrow would bring the beginning of a major change in their justice system. The morning of the Judicial Review Board hearing arrived with a tension that filled the entire courthouse. Sarah stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom, adjusting her suit jacket. The same one she had worn when Judge Harrison had fined her just weeks ago. This time, though, she wasn't walking into his courtroom as a defendant. "The board members have arrived," Marcus whispered, poking his head into the preparation room where Sarah and her team were doing final checks of their evidence. 5 distinguished judges from across the state would hear their case against Judge Harrison today. The hearing room was larger than a regular courtroom, with dark wood panels and high windows that let in streams of morning light. Judge Harrison sat at one end with his attorney, looking confident and slightly bored. He barely glanced at Sarah as she entered with her team. "He still thinks this is about a traffic ticket," Tom murmured as they set up their presentation materials. The young public defender had helped prepare dozens of charts and graphs for today. Their evidence filled 3 large boxes, each document carefully labeled and organized. Sarah watched as the review board members took their seats. She recognized Justice Chen, known for her strict adherence to ethical standards, and Justice Roberts, who had previously led investigations into judicial misconduct. These were people who would understand patterns and evidence. "This hearing will now come to order," announced Justice Chen, her voice firm and clear. "We are here to review allegations of systematic bias and discrimination against Judge Richard Harrison. Ms. Matthews, you may present your evidence." Sarah stood, feeling the same calm focus she had known during her FBI testimony days. "Members of the board," she began, her voice steady, "what you're about to see isn't about one traffic stop or one instance of bias. This is about 8 years of documented discrimination that has harmed hundreds of people in our community." Judge Harrison shifted in his seat as Sarah started presenting the statistical evidence. His confident smile began to fade as she showed graph after graph, each one revealing clear patterns of discriminatory sentencing. "In traffic violation cases," Sarah explained, pointing to a large chart, "minority defendants paid an average of 340% higher fines than white defendants for identical offenses." She clicked to the next slide. Over 500 cases showed this pattern. The board members leaned forward, examining the numbers carefully. Justice Roberts removed his glasses, his expression growing more serious with each new piece of evidence. Mary Johnson, the court clerk, testified next. Her hands shook slightly as she explained what she had witnessed over the years, but her voice remained strong. "I kept records of everything," she said, presenting her meticulous documentation. The different treatment was systematic and deliberate. Judge Harrison's attorney tried to interrupt, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, but Justice Chen silenced him with a raised hand. "Let her finish," the justice said firmly. Tom presented the public defender's office records next, showing how defendants of color consistently received harsher sentences and fewer opportunities to present evidence. His data matched perfectly with Mary's records, creating an undeniable pattern. Then came the testimony that made Judge Harrison finally lose his composed expression: the audio recordings from Jenny Kim, the courthouse intern. The room fell silent as they listened to his unguarded comments between cases, his bias clear in his own words. "That's been tampered with," Judge Harrison suddenly burst out, standing up. His face had turned red, and his hands gripped the table in front of him. "This is a witch hunt." "Please be seated, Judge Harrison," Justice Chen ordered, her voice sharp. "The authenticity of these recordings has already been verified by forensic experts." Sarah continued methodically presenting evidence, just as she had done in her FBI days. She showed video testimonies from dozens of defendants who had faced discrimination in Harrison's courtroom. Each story built upon the last, creating a picture that was impossible to ignore. Finally, Sarah said, reaching the end of her presentation, "I stand before you not just as a former FBI agent who specialized in civil rights violations, but as someone who experienced Judge Harrison's bias firsthand." She described her own experience in his courtroom, now placing it in the context of hundreds of similar cases. The review board members exchanged glances as Sarah finished. Judge Harrison sat slumped in his chair, his earlier confidence completely gone. His attorney shuffled papers nervously, knowing they had no effective defense against such overwhelming evidence. "The board will recess to deliberate," Justice Chen announced. As they left the room, Sarah caught a glimpse of Judge Harrison's face. For the first time, he looked afraid, not of her, but of the truth she had exposed. The Judicial Review Board took 3 days to reach their decision. For Sarah and her team, these were 3 days of nervous waiting, checking phones for updates, and wondering if their evidence had been enough. They gathered in Marcus's office on the morning of the announcement, everyone too anxious to sit still. "The board is ready," Tom announced, rushing into the office after receiving a call from the courthouse. His tie was crooked, and his usually neat hair showed signs of running his fingers through it too many times. They want everyone there in an hour. The hearing room was packed when they arrived. News reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready. Community members who had testified sat together, holding hands and whispering prayers. Judge Harrison entered last, looking older than he had just 3 days ago, his usual confident stride replaced by tired steps. Justice Chen cleared her throat as she prepared to read the board's decision. The room fell so quiet that Sarah could hear the old ceiling fan squeaking above them. She felt Mary's hand grip her arm tightly. After careful review of all evidence presented, Justice Chen began, her voice echoing in the silent room. This board finds Judge Richard Harrison guilty of systematic discrimination and abuse of judicial power. She paused as a collective gasp filled the room. Judge Harrison's face turned pale as Justice Chen continued reading. The evidence presented by Sarah Matthews and her team shows a clear and disturbing pattern of racial bias in sentencing, spanning 8 years and affecting hundreds of cases. Sarah watched as Justice Roberts opened a thick folder. The board's decision is as follows, he announced, his deep voice carrying authority that silenced the whispers in the room. First, Judge Harrison is suspended immediately from his duties, pending a complete review of all cases under his jurisdiction. The news reporters' cameras clicked rapidly as Justice Roberts continued. Second, all defendants who received discriminatory sentences in Judge Harrison's court will have their cases reviewed by an independent panel. Fines paid under these biased rulings will be refunded. Tears started flowing down Mary's face as she heard this. She had witnessed so many people struggle to pay those unfair fines over the years. Tom reached over and squeezed her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. Third, Justice Chen took over again. Judge Harrison must undergo comprehensive bias training and psychological evaluation before any consideration of reinstatement. However, she paused, looking directly at Harrison. This board recommends permanent disbarment. The room erupted in murmurs and gasps. Judge Harrison slumped in his chair, his attorney frantically whispering in his ear. But the board wasn't finished. Furthermore, Justice Roberts continued once the room quieted. This investigation has revealed concerning patterns that may exist in other courtrooms. Therefore, the board is implementing mandatory bias training for all judges in the district and establishing a new oversight committee to monitor sentencing patterns. Sarah felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her. This was even better than she had hoped, not just punishment for one biased judge, but systemic changes to prevent future discrimination. Finally, Justice Chen concluded, this board commends Sarah Matthews and her team for their thorough investigation and presentation of evidence. Their work has exposed a serious issue in our judicial system and created an opportunity for meaningful reform. As the hearing ended, people began approaching Sarah and her team. Community members hugged them, crying and expressing thanks. Other judges from the district, who had stayed silent during the investigation, now came forward to offer support for the reforms. Outside the courthouse, Reverend Wallace spoke to the gathered news crews. Today, justice wasn't blind. It opened its eyes and saw the truth, he said, his voice full of emotion. This victory belongs to everyone who had the courage to speak up. Sarah watched from the courthouse steps as Judge Harrison left through a side door, reporters following him. His shoulders were slumped, his former arrogance replaced by the weight of his exposed bias. She felt no joy in his downfall, only satisfaction that the system had worked as it should. What happens now? Tom asked, standing beside her with his hands in his pockets. Sarah smiled, thinking of all the work still ahead. Now we make sure these reforms actually happen, she said. The real change starts tomorrow, when we begin reviewing those cases and helping people get their justice. As the sun set behind the courthouse, Sarah thought about how a simple traffic stop had led to this moment. Sometimes justice took unexpected paths, but with enough determination and evidence, the truth would always find its way to the light. 1 year after Judge Harrison's removal from the bench, Sarah Matthews stood in front of a room full of newly appointed judges. The courthouse had changed quite a bit since her traffic court appearance. New policies were in place, oversight committees were active, and a spirit of reform filled the halls. Your Honor isn't just a title, Sarah explained to the attentive audience. It's a responsibility to treat everyone fairly. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation. showing statistics from the past year's reforms. The numbers told a story of positive change. More consistent sentencing, fewer appeals, and higher public trust in the courts. Tom, now promoted to senior public defender, sat in the back of the room taking notes. He still couldn't believe how much had changed since that day he watched Sarah stand up to Judge Harrison. His own caseload had become more manageable now that judges were required to give proper time and consideration to each defendant. The systems we put in place are working, Sarah continued, pointing to a graph showing dramatically reduced disparities in sentencing. But they only work if everyone stays vigilant. She had made these training sessions her new mission, turning her FBI experience into lessons for the next generation of judicial leaders. Mary Johnson, still working as court clerk, but now heading the new oversight committee, smiled from her seat. She remembered the fear she had felt when first sharing those court records with Sarah. Now, she was helping train other court staff to recognize and report signs of bias. Last month, Sarah told the judges, a defendant in traffic court noticed unfair treatment and knew exactly how to report it. The system responded immediately, reviewing the case and correcting the issue. That's progress. She didn't mention that the judge in question had been one of Harrison's former colleagues. Some details were better left unsaid. After the training, Sarah walked through the courthouse hallways, remembering that day 1 year ago. The same marble floors that had echoed with her heels now carried the footsteps of a more diverse group of judges and lawyers. The building felt different, more welcoming, more just. Sarah, Reverend Wallace called out, catching up to her near the entrance. He had become a regular presence in the courthouse, helping community members navigate the new systems put in place. You won't believe what happened today. Remember Mrs. Thompson's case from last year? Sarah nodded. Mrs. Thompson had been one of hundreds who had paid unfair fines under Judge Harrison. The case review panel had not only refunded her money, but had also cleared her record of the unjust charges. Well, Reverend Wallace continued, beaming, she used that refund money to help her grandson start college. He's studying law, says he wants to be part of the change. His eyes twinkled as he shared the news. Later that afternoon, Sarah met with Marcus in his office, which had grown busier since their investigation. His law firm now specialized in judicial accountability cases, and lawyers from across the country sought his advice on similar reforms. Look at this, Marcus said, showing Sarah a letter from a neighboring state's Supreme Court. They were requesting guidance on implementing similar oversight measures. Your traffic ticket started a movement, Sarah. Other districts are following our lead. Sarah smiled, remembering how different things had been just 1 year ago. The changes hadn't been easy. Some judges had resisted the new oversight, and a few had even resigned rather than adapt, but the system was stronger for it. As she prepared to leave, Jenny Kim, the former intern who had recorded Judge Harrison's biased comments, stopped by. She wasn't an intern anymore. She had finished law school and was now working as a junior attorney in the public defender's office. I have my first solo case tomorrow, Jenny told Sarah excitedly. And you know what? I'm not afraid to challenge the judge if I see something wrong. You taught us all that. That evening, Sarah stood on the courthouse steps, watching the sunset just as she had done the day of the board's decision. A young woman approached her, looking nervous but determined. Miss Matthews, the woman said, I have a traffic court appearance tomorrow, and something doesn't feel right about how my case is being handled. Sarah listened carefully to the woman's story, just as she had done countless times over the past year. Some might have seen her traffic ticket as bad luck, but Sarah knew better. It had been a wake-up call, a chance to make real change. Let me help you understand your rights, Sarah said warmly, leading the woman inside. The courthouse doors closed behind them, but the legacy of that one traffic stop, that one moment of standing up to injustice, would continue opening doors for others for years to come.